It started with real deaths, not dreams.
What if the most terrifying part of A Nightmare on Elm Street wasn't the movie, but the fact that it actually happened? In the 1980s, healthy young men began dying in their sleep for no medical reason, terrified of closing their eyes. These real-life sleep deaths are the dark origin story behind Freddy Krueger. Welcome to the Conjuring Files, where we explore the reality behind the legends, the history behind the horror, and the human stories buried beneath the myth. I'm your guide, and today we're not chasing a dreamstalker with claws. We're uncovering the real nightmare that haunted Southeast Asian refugees and inspired one of cinema's most iconic villains. In 1981, director Wes Craven read a series of articles in the Los Angeles Times that chilled him to the bone. Dozens of otherwise healthy Hmong men, refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, were dying in their sleep. Autopsies found no cause of death. Their bodies were perfect. Yet they were found frozen in terror, faces contorted, often mid-scream. One report described a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, whispering, "If I close my eyes, it gets me." Craven was haunted. He clipped the articles, pinned them to his wall, and began writing. But he didn't invent Freddy Krueger from thin air. He took the core truth, that fear could kill, and gave it a face. A burned, scarred face, a glove of blades, a laugh that echoed through dreams. Freddy wasn't just a monster. He was a metaphor for helplessness. In the film, parents can't protect their children. Doctors offer no answers. The rules are unknowable, just like in real life. Because the true horror of Elm Street isn't the boiler room. It's the bedroom, where you're supposed to be safe, but aren't. So what if Freddy wasn't born in a script, but in a morgue? Next, the tragic story of the Hmong refugees and why their dreams became death sentences. To understand the nightmare, we have to look back at the secret war in Laos. For years, the Hmong fought alongside American forces. When the US withdrew in 1975, they were left behind. Thousands fled across the Mekong River, carrying the trauma of loss into their new lives in America. But it wasn't just memories that haunted them, it was a spiritual disconnect. The Hmong believed that the soul is fragile. In the displacement of refugee life, many felt their protective spirits were left behind. Without a shaman, they were exposed to the tsog, the crushing spirit. When the CDC investigators arrived, they were baffled. The victims were young, athletic, and had no history of heart disease. They found that these men weren't just dying, they were refusing to sleep, drinking pots of coffee, staying up for days, terrified of what waited in the dark. It was a collective psychological crisis manifesting as a physical death. The fear was so intense, it literally stopped their hearts. Medical science eventually categorized this as Brugada Syndrome, a genetic condition that causes lethal heart rhythms during sleep. But why did it strike so many at once? The extreme stress of the refugee experience acted as a trigger, turning a hidden vulnerability into a death sentence. Wes Craven saw the tragedy and saw a monster. But the real story is more heartbreaking. It's a story of survival, sacrifice, and the price of safety. They survived a war, only to be hunted by their own dreams in a land that promised them a new beginning. Today, we remember them not as the inspiration for a horror icon, but as victims of a unique and tragic chapter of history. The Conjuring Files will continue to dig deep. I'm your guide. Sleep well, if you can. Music swells and fades out over static.
They escaped war, but not the night.
To understand Freddy Krueger's origin, we must first understand the Hmong people, an ethnic group from the mountains of Laos who fought alongside US forces during the Vietnam War. They were the unsung allies in a secret conflict. But when the war ended, the promises were forgotten. They were abandoned. Hunted by communist regimes, thousands fled through the jungle, crossing the Mekong River into refugee camps. They eventually reached America, only to face a new kind of battle: poverty, racism, and cultural isolation. But for many Hmong refugees, the worst enemy wasn't outside in the streets. It was inside their sleep. By the late 1970s, doctors in California, Minnesota, and North Carolina began reporting a baffling phenomenon. Young Hmong men, aged 18 to 35, were dying in their sleep, healthy, strong, gone. There was no heart disease, no drugs, no signs of struggle except for the expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. Families reported victims staying awake for days, drinking coffee, playing cards, pacing hallways. They were terrified to close their eyes. They said a shadow was watching, one widow recalled, that it waited in the corner of their dreams. Medical journals called it sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, or SUNDS, a label for the unexplainable. But within the Hmong community, it had another name, tsog, a malevolent spirit that sits on your chest and steals your breath, a nightmare that carries weight. In folklore, tsog attacks those burdened by guilt, unresolved grief, or spiritual imbalance. For refugees, it was the weight of survival. For those who'd witnessed war and lost families, the tsog wasn't myth. It was memory made manifest, a ghost of the past. One case stands out, a 22-year-old man in Merced who refused to sleep for 4 nights to stay alive. On the 5th night, exhaustion won. His roommate found him later that night, dead. His eyes were wide open, his hands clawing at his own throat as if trying to breathe. His last words, "It's here." Director Wes Craven read these accounts in the LA Times. He didn't know the word tsog, but he felt the horror. He understood its essence. Trauma doesn't end when the war does. It follows you into your dreams. And sometimes, it never lets you wake up. Because Freddy's claws weren't the weapon. The real killer was the fear itself. The fear of what we cannot escape. Next, the science behind SUNDS and why medicine finally caught up with folklore. We look at the heart. For years, the deaths were a total mystery. But in the 1990s, researchers identified a genetic condition called Brugada Syndrome, which disrupts the heart's electrical rhythm. But genetics weren't the only trigger. Researchers found that the extreme stress of relocation, coupled with the survivor's guilt and the absence of traditional spiritual protection, created a perfect storm of biological and psychological vulnerability. In the depths of a nightmare, the body's sympathetic nervous system goes into overdrive. For these men, the fear was so intense that their hearts literally stopped. The tsog was a cultural name for a physiological catastrophe. Today, the Hmong community has found ways to bridge their ancient traditions with modern medicine. They honor the memory of those lost by ensuring the next generation lives without that same crushing weight of trauma. Freddy Krueger remains a titan of horror cinema, but he is also a permanent, unintended monument to a real-life tragedy. A reminder that the most terrifying monsters aren't born of the imagination, but of our deepest, unhealed wounds. Wes Craven's masterpiece changed horror forever. But the true story of the Hmong people and the shadow in their dreams reminds us that the line between folklore and reality is thinner than we think. Sleep is our most private refuge and our most vulnerable battlefield. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the true origin of nightmares compelling, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows of history. Sleep well, if you can.
Fear told their hearts to stop, and they obeyed.
For years, a medical mystery haunted the United States. It was called SUNDS, Sudden Unexpected Nocturnal Death Syndrome. How could healthy young hearts just stop? No warning, no struggle, only the silence of sleep. To understand the deaths, we have to look back at the secret war. In the 1960s and 70s, the CIA recruited the Hmong people of Laos to fight against communist forces. They were the forgotten allies, surviving unimaginable brutality. When the US withdrew in 1975, the Hmong faced a genocide, forcing thousands to flee through jungles and across the Mekong River. By the late 70s, they began arriving in America. But safety brought a new kind of terror. The deaths didn't peak in the refugee camps or during the war. They spiked in the quiet of American apartments. In that newfound safety, the mind finally had the space to remember, to grieve, to fear. And in that silence, an ancient nightmare returned. The Hmong called it Dab Tsog, the night hag. They believed a malevolent spirit would sit on their chests, suffocating them while they slept. In a new land where they couldn't perform the traditional rituals to appease ancestral spirits, the fear was paralyzing. Men refused to sleep. They drank coffee all night, terrified that the moment they closed their eyes, they would never wake up. In the 1990s, science finally caught up. Cardiologists identified Brugada Syndrome, a genetic condition prevalent in Southeast Asian populations. It affects the heart's sodium channels, disrupting the electrical rhythm. Most dangerously, it triggers during vagal tone, when the body is at its deepest state of rest. For the Hmong, biology was meeting biography. Their hearts were genetically vulnerable, and their nervous systems were overloaded by chronic trauma. This real-life panic reached a filmmaker named Wes Craven. He read a series of articles in the LA Times about a young Hmong man who stayed awake for 6 days, convinced his dreams would kill him. When he finally fell asleep, his family heard him scream. By the time they reached him, he was dead. This wasn't just a story, it was the birth of cinematic language for a real-world betrayal. Craven turned the Hmong's tragedy into Freddy Krueger. Freddy doesn't attack you in the street. He waits until you're most vulnerable, trusting the world to keep you safe in sleep. In the 1980s, America was processing its own fears of urban decay and the loss of domestic safety. Freddy became the face of a decade's collective anxiety, rooted in a very real, very lethal heart condition. Today, we have defibrillators and genetic screening. The dread of the 1980s has faded into medical history and movie trivia. But the story of SUNDS remains a haunting reminder that our bodies are the maps of our history, and sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we carry into the silence of the night.
The tsog comes when rituals are forgotten. When you abandon your ancestors, the night claims you.
A Nightmare on Elm Street didn't just scare audiences, it mirrored them. Released in 1984, the film tapped into deep cultural anxieties of the era. The 1980s were a time of invisible threats: AIDS, nuclear war, economic instability. Parents felt powerless. Children were told to just say no to drugs, but what about nightmares? What about the monsters that came when you closed your eyes? Freddy Krueger embodied that helplessness. He wasn't an outsider like Jason or Michael Myers. He was created by the town, a child killer burned alive by angry parents who thought they'd solved the problem. But evil doesn't die. It evolves, and it returns through the one place parents can't guard: dreams. Freddy also reflected America's guilt over the Vietnam War. The Hmong, who'd been promised protection, were forgotten. Their suffering was invisible. Freddy, too, was a ghost of past sins, returning to punish the next generation for the failures of the last. Even the film's rules felt real. You die if you fall asleep. Your friends can't save you. The adults don't believe you. Sound familiar? It's the same logic as SUNDS. Healthy kids dying for no reason, while doctors shrugged. Today, we see echoes in viral stories of sleep paralysis demons, shadow figures, chest pressure, inability to move. Science explains it as a glitch in REM sleep, but culturally, it's the same fear. Something is hunting us in the dark. Freddy endures because he's not just a slasher. He's the embodiment of every time we've been told, "It's just a dream," when it felt like so much more. Next, why the truth behind Freddy is more terrifying than the fiction.
Freddy was fiction, but the terror was real.
Nightmare on Elm Street remains the most grounded slasher franchise, not because of gore, but because its core fear is real. Unlike zombies or vampires, Freddy's power comes from a documented phenomenon: fear can kill. It began with a series of articles in the LA Times. Healthy young men from Southeast Asia, refugees from a war-torn land, were dying in their sleep. They weren't sick. They were terrified. They told their families they were afraid to sleep because something was chasing them in their dreams. One specific case haunted Wes Craven, a young boy who stayed awake for days, drinking coffee, hiding it in his closet. He told his parents, "If I sleep, he'll get me." When he finally succumbed to exhaustion, they heard a scream. By the time they reached him, he was dead. Knowing that SUNDS, sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, claimed over 100 Hmong lives in the US alone, makes Freddy's nursery rhyme chillingly literal. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. It wasn't just a threat. For some families, it was a countdown. To the medical examiners, it was a mystery. To the Hmong elders, it was tsog, a jealous hag spirit that sits on the chest of the sleeper, stealing their breath. They believed their ancestors were punishing them for leaving their homeland. The trauma of war wasn't just a memory, it was a ghost. Craven didn't just want a killer, he wanted a primal archetype. The razor glove wasn't a knife, it was an extension of nature's oldest predators. The cave bear, the tiger. He tapped into a fear older than language. For the Hmong refugees, this primal fear wasn't a movie villain, it was the loss of their spiritual protection in a foreign land. We now call it the Brugada sign, a deadly shark fin curve on an EKG. It's a glitch in the heart's sodium channels. But here is where science meets horror. This genetic time bomb is often triggered by extreme stress. The terror these men felt in their dreams wasn't just a nightmare. It was a biological key, turning the lock on their own hearts. We must distinguish this from common sleep paralysis, the old hag syndrome, where you wake up frozen, seeing a shadow. That is terrifying, but harmless. SUNDS is a different beast. It is the body failing under the weight of the mind. The autonomic nervous system simply crashes. They didn't just see the monster, they felt him stop their pulse. In the films, the only defense is lucid dreaming, realizing you are asleep and taking control. This mirrors real-world therapy for nightmare disorders today. We teach patients to rewrite the ending of their dreams. In a way, Wes Craven was prescribing a cure before medical science caught up. We defeat the monster by changing the script. And that's what separates Elm Street from other horrors. Michael Myers is a force of nature. Freddy is a consequence. He exists because society failed to protect refugees, to listen to trauma, to understand that some wounds don't bleed, but still kill. Modern retellings have softened Freddy into a wisecracking villain, but the original's power lies in its silence. In the final scene, Nancy defeats Freddy not with weapons, but by taking away his power, by refusing to fear him. It's a metaphor for healing. Trauma loses its grip when we stop running. Nancy turns her back on the monster, and he vanishes. It's the only way to survive a nightmare born of trauma. Yet, the real-world legacy continues. Brugada Syndrome still claims lives. We have defibrillators now, but we can't cure the fear. Refugee communities still carry intergenerational trauma, and millions still lie awake, afraid of what waits in the dark. So the true nightmare isn't Freddy Krueger, it's the knowledge that some terrors don't need claws to kill. They just need silence and sleep. If this exploration of the real sleep deaths behind A Nightmare on Elm Street moved you, educated you, or changed how you see horror, do us a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the Conjuring Files. Share it with someone who believes the scariest stories are the ones rooted in truth. Because the truth isn't in the boiler room, it's in the breath that never came back.